I didn't mean to stare. But there she was, standing in front of the strawberry stand, sunlight catching in her hair like a halo I couldn't quite place. She moved with a kind of quiet grace that made everything else in the market fade, the shouting vendors, the clatter of carts, the tang of fresh herbs and ripe tomatoes. I was 20, half lost in the weekend crowd, and yet suddenly, I was very aware of every inch between us. "Could you help me carry this home?" she asked, holding up a wicker basket that looked far heavier than she was willing to admit. Her voice was calm, soft-edged, but something in the slight hesitation, the way her hand lingered on the handle, made me lean in. Sure," I said, taking the basket from her. My fingers brushed hers, and I felt it, a small spark, like static electricity traveling up my arm. She smiled at me then, just a small, quick curl of her lips, but it hit deeper than any words could. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't just that. There was a sense of life lived quietly, moments tucked away, regrets and laughter folded into her posture. She carried herself with confidence, yet the barest tremor in her hands betrayed a vulnerability I wasn't supposed to notice. We walked slowly, navigating around a leaning display of pumpkins. I kept catching glimpses of her, the way the sunlight hit her cheek, the soft sway of her hair, the subtle fragrance of something like lavender and sun-warmed skin. Every step brought us closer, and I felt the hum of tension in the space between us, unspoken and stubbornly persistent. "Do you come here often?" I asked, because silence was suddenly unbearable. She glanced at me, brow raised, eyes sparkling with a faint, teasing amusement. "I could ask you the same." I laughed, a little too loudly, and she did too, but it was brief. Then she fell silent again, and I realized how loud my own heartbeat sounded in comparison to the quiet warmth she carried beside me. At the corner, she stopped. Her hand lingered on the basket as though holding it was an excuse to linger near me. I noticed how the sunlight caught her rings, the subtle motion of her wrist, the way her fingers brushed against mine again as I steadied the load. That small contact lingered longer than it should have, a language neither of us spoke aloud. For a moment, the world shrank to the narrow path between her and me, and I wondered if she felt it too, the pull, the quiet electricity, the weight of something unsaid. Then a child's laughter pierced the bubble, and she jerked slightly, looking past me toward the entrance of the market. A man's voice called her name from across the square, unfamiliar but insistent. Her expression tightened for a fraction of a second, something between concern and annoyance. But her eyes flicked back to mine, a flash of that same warmth, that subtle vulnerability, that quiet invitation. I realized, standing there with her, holding a basket that felt far too heavy and yet somehow insignificant, that nothing about this moment was ordinary. And I couldn't stop watching her. "Wait," she started, turning her head as the interruption pressed in, her voice catching just enough to make my chest tighten. But before I could ask her what, or offer to follow, she gave me that smile again, soft, knowing, and impossibly magnetic. And just like that, the world outside the bubble of our proximity began creeping back in. We left the market in an awkward half-step, the wicker basket between us more of a bridge than a burden. She moved carefully, but I could tell she was used to carrying weight, physical and otherwise. The way she shifted her shoulders, the small exhale as if letting go of something invisible, made me notice everything. "So, do you live around here?" I asked, fumbling with my words. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet street, even though it wasn't quiet at all. "Yes," she said softly, almost reluctantly, her eyes flicking to a side street as if measuring distance or time. "I've been here a while. It's peaceful enough." I nodded, though I wasn't sure what to say. She glanced at me then, for a fraction longer than necessary, and I felt it, the pull of her gaze, subtle but insistent. I remembered the first time I noticed her, weeks ago, from across the fence that separated our yards. She had been planting something in the late afternoon sun, her hair pinned loosely, a laugh escaping as she realized a bird had perched on her shoulder. That single, unguarded moment had burned itself into my memory. Now, standing beside her, I understood why she kept parts of herself reserved. The way she moved, with care but also hesitation, hinted at past hurts. Widowed, perhaps more than once, not just in marriage, but in the small betrayals of friendship, trust, and circumstance. There was a quiet strength in her, yes, but also a tremor, as if she were still testing whether the world could hurt her again. I caught myself staring, though I tried not to. There was something impossible about noticing her so completely. She was older, experienced, and here I was, young and still learning who I was, captivated without permission. There was risk in this. Everyone would call it inappropriate, I thought, if anyone noticed. But risk doesn't always taste bitter. Sometimes it hums, low and urgent, like the tension in the air now. We rounded a corner, and I carried the basket a little faster to ease the silence. She trailed a hand along the wicker, brushing mine again, lightly, intentionally, before pulling back. My fingers tingled long after contact, and I forced myself to focus on the uneven pavement. "You like strawberries?" she asked, breaking the silence, but not really. Her voice had that intimate cadence, soft but direct, as if it belonged to someone who knew how to draw attention without demanding it. "Yeah," I replied, and immediately felt childish. I mean they're good. Fresh ones I like." Words stumbled, tripping over themselves. Her eyes softened, and she smiled, just the barest curve of her lips. "It's okay," she said, almost teasing, almost pitying. "You don't have to explain everything." I realized my pulse had quickened, not from exertion but from the nearness of her. She leaned slightly forward to adjust the strap of the basket, and our elbows brushed. Warmth pooled into the small space between us, the kind that makes it impossible to concentrate on anything else. "You're observant," she said suddenly, her voice low. I looked at her, startled. She wasn't accusing, it was a statement, soft and knowing. I felt my chest tighten. "I try," I admitted, eyes dropping. We paused at the corner of her street, a quiet threshold between public and private, between restraint and impulse. She looked at me, the slightest hesitation in her posture, then reached for the basket and set it down. The weight of her gaze pressed into me as much as the wicker did. For a moment, there was no need for words. I noticed how the sunlight caught the warmth in her hair, how her hand lingered near mine, not touching, not yet, but hovering as if measuring courage. And I realized, in that quiet, charged moment, that we were both aware of everything we weren't saying. Then she exhaled, almost imperceptibly, and I felt a shift. My fingers itched to brush hers again, to test the boundary. But instead, I just stayed close, careful, and let the silence speak. The air between us hummed. Something unspoken had passed, something delicate and fragile and irresistible. And as I watched her step back toward her door, I knew this, the nearness, the tiny touches, the stolen glances, was only the beginning. I hadn't realized how quiet her living room could feel. The soft tick of a wall clock, the low hum of distant traffic, and the faint scent of her lavender candles filled the space as she set the basket down. I followed her in, noticing the way her posture shifted, subtle, careful, almost like she was bracing herself. "You didn't have to help me all the way inside," she said, but the words were lighter than her gaze, which lingered on mine longer than usual. "I wanted to," I said quickly, too eager, and realized I was holding my breath. She smiled, just a hint, and the corner of her lips lifted in a way that made me aware of my own pulse. I stepped closer to adjust a strap of the basket that had slipped, and our fingers brushed again. That small contact felt like an electric current, and I caught myself staring at her lips for a fraction too long. A sudden knock at the door startled both of us. She glanced over her shoulder, tension tightening her shoulders. "It's probably just a delivery," she said, but the slight edge in her voice betrayed her unease. The interruption was enough to yank us apart, but even as she opened the door for a brief exchange, I noticed how her back arched slightly, how her hand lingered on the door frame longer than necessary. And then it was just the two of us again, the room shrinking to the distance between our chests. We moved toward the kitchen, carrying empty bags from the wicker basket. I tried to focus on setting them down neatly, but her presence was magnetic. Her hair brushed my shoulder as she reached past me for a jar, and I could feel her warmth through the thin fabric of her blouse. She didn't flinch at my nearness, but she didn't encourage it either, just hovered in that dangerous, delicious space. I didn't expect company, I murmured, breaking the silence, though my voice sounded too loud even to me. You never know, she replied softly, not meeting my eyes. People can appear when you least want them. Her words hung between us, and I could feel the tension coil tighter. I wanted to say something, anything, but fear of what anyone would think, what I should feel, knotted my stomach. Our gazes collided, and for a heartbeat, it was almost unbearable. I leaned in slightly, and she tilted her head, the faintest inhale catching in her throat. My lips hovered dangerously close, but then a text tone chimed from my pocket, sharp and intrusive. I cursed softly under my breath, and she exhaled a relieved, almost impatient sigh. See? She said quietly, eyes glimmering with something unreadable. Distractions are necessary sometimes. I nodded, though my pulse was still racing, and she closed the small gap between us as if to steady herself. Her hand brushed mine, not by accident, I realized, and for the first time, either of us pulled away immediately. We stood there, fingers touching, breaths mingling without acknowledgement. The air seemed thick, charged, and impossibly close. Guilt flickered. Should I be here? Should I feel this? But it was overpowered by something far more compelling, a draw I couldn't name or resist. Her eyes met mine, searching, hesitant, almost questioning. I wanted to speak, to confess the swirl of thoughts, but the words stuck somewhere between my chest and my tongue. Instead, we stayed in that suspended, quiet moment, pulled closer than we should have been, yet neither of us stepping back. And for a few fleeting seconds the world outside her door, the judgment, the age gap, the impossibility of it all, didn't exist. It was just us, suspended in the tension of near touch, heartbeats echoing, waiting, holding on to the fragile promise of what could, maybe, be. The afternoon light slanted through her curtains, casting stripes across the floor, across her, across the space between us. I hadn't meant to linger, but I couldn't stop noticing the subtle rise and fall of her chest, the way her hair caught the sunlight, and the faint scent of something soft and warm, like cedar in morning. You think too much, she said suddenly, voice low, almost a whisper, as she leaned against the counter. My pulse skipped. I can't help it, I admitted, trying to sound casual, but my fingers itched to reach for hers again. It's hard not to notice you. Her breath hitched slightly. She shifted, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and I caught the motion, memorized it. My hand lifted almost without thought, hovering near her face, craving the warmth of her skin. She didn't pull away, but there was a taut line in her jaw, a hesitation that made everything feel like it could snap at any second. I shouldn't. She started, then stopped, eyes flicking away. The weight of unsaid words pressed into the air, heavy and unbearable. Her hand drifted toward mine, a brush that lingered longer than necessary, sending shivers up my arm. You what? I asked, voice barely audible. Nothing, she said, though I knew better. The flicker in her gaze, the small tremor in her fingers, it all screamed confession without a single word. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and she didn't retreat. Her body was so near that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her, the curve of her shoulder brushing against my chest. Every instinct told me to close the distance, to risk it all in one bold move, but 1,000 little hesitations held me back. Her, me, the world outside, the impossible odds stacked quietly between us. I started, then stopped, throat tight. My hand hovered near her temple, trembling slightly as I imagined tucking that stray hair behind her ear, feeling the smoothness of her skin under my fingers. She tilted her head toward me, almost imperceptibly, and I felt my resolve crumble. Don't, she whispered, but it wasn't the word of denial. It was more fragile, a plea tangled with want, with restraint. Her lips parted slightly, and the faintest intake of breath brushed across my own face. My fingers brushed hers again, this time intentionally, and I felt her stiffness soften, just enough for me to know she was aware, terribly aware, of everything that could happen between us. I could smell her, faintly sweet, impossibly close, and it made the air around us taut, vibrating with unspoken possibilities. I began again, words failing me as my heart threatened to drown out all reason. Her eyes searched mine, urgent, vulnerable, daring, and for a second the entire world narrowed to the space between our lips, the faint warmth of our fingers touching, the impossible closeness of our bodies. Then she whispered, almost too softly to hear, "If anyone saw," and the sentence hung unfinished, the tension sharp enough to cut. My thumb brushed the back of her hand, steadying, grounding, aching for more. Everything in me surged, the desire, the fear, the longing, all colliding in a silent plea that was louder than any voice. Her lips were so near I could feel her breath, the faint catch in her throat mirrored my own. And just as I leaned in, just as the space between us dwindled to nothing, the phone on the counter buzzed, a sharp, sudden intrusion. She flinched, and my heart skipped a painful beat. I froze. She stared at me, eyes wide, something unspoken blazing between us, and I realized, this was it. The line had been crossed, the moment existed, and everything we'd tried to deny now hovered, trembling, on the edge. The next morning, I found her on her porch, hands wrapped around a steaming mug, staring at the quiet street like she was trying to read the world and failing. I hesitated on the step, my own mug half forgotten in my grip. "You're early," she said softly, without turning. The words weren't accusatory, they were measured, almost cautious, but her shoulders tensed slightly, betraying the calm tone. "I couldn't sleep," I admitted, voice low. I stepped closer, and she flinched just slightly, just enough to make me notice. The air between us tightened, charged with the remnants of yesterday, the near touch, the stolen glances, the electricity that hummed under her skin and mine. "Did you want to talk about yesterday?" she asked, finally turning. Her eyes met mine, and the faintest tremor ran through her hand as she tilted the mug. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. I wanted to, had rehearsed a dozen confessions in my head, but then she spoke again, and the words hit me harder than I expected. "I shouldn't be," she started, then paused, eyes dropping to the floor. When she finally looked back, her gaze was sharper, almost pained. "I wasn't entirely honest with you yesterday." My pulse quickened, every instinct buzzing. "What do you mean?" She took a breath, slow, deliberate, as if weighing the consequences of each syllable. I wasn't just worried about what anyone would think," she said. Her fingers trembled on the mug's rim. "I didn't want to feel this. Not with someone so much younger. Not like this." I swallowed, my chest tightening in a mix of frustration and longing. "You mean you wanted it too?" Her lips parted, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped back slightly, almost instinctively, and I noticed how her eyes flicked to the street as if someone might be watching, even though it was empty. My fingers itched to reach for hers, to erase the space she'd suddenly created, but I held myself back, conscious of the fragile boundary between us. "Yes," she whispered finally. "I've been lonely more than I realized. And you see things I don't let anyone else see." Her confession hit me in a way nothing else could. I felt the heat in my chest, the sharp, dizzying pull of desire mixed with the thrill of forbidden territory. Every rule I tried to follow, every restraint I'd imposed on myself, unraveled in that single word, yes. But then reality clawed back. "What about people noticing?" I asked, the tiniest tremor in my voice betraying my fear. She looked at me then, fully, eyes blazing with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Let them notice," she said quietly. "I don't care. Not anymore." The words wrapped around me like fire, and I felt her close before she even moved, her hand brushing mine as she stepped past me to set her mug on the railing. The contact lingered, deliberate, electric. Her body was almost brushing mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her shoulder against my arm, the faint scent of her perfume teasing my senses. We stood like that for a long beat, suspended between desire and fear, the world shrinking to the narrow space where her presence overwhelmed me. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, hear hers in the silence, see every subtle shiver, every hesitation, every fleeting glance. And then she took a breath, slow, almost daring me. "Are you going to run?" she asked softly, just loud enough for me to hear. I shook my head, words failing me. I only stepped closer, drawn in despite the fear, despite the rules, despite the world outside our fragile bubble. My hand hovered near hers, trembling slightly, and I felt the pull of inevitability, the moment where nothing could be undone, where desire, fear, and confession collided into one undeniable force. For a second, nothing moved. The street was silent. The air between us thick. And then, as I reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. She let it hover, letting the electricity linger, letting the moment stretch towards something neither of us could yet name, but both of us desperately wanted. The porch felt impossibly small. Every sound, the distant hum of traffic, a bird calling, the soft rustle of leaves, was swallowed by the space between us. I could feel her presence like a living thing, pressing softly against me without a word, her warmth radiating through the thin fabric of our shirts. You really mean that?" I whispered, voice catching, conscious of the way it trembled. Her eyes searched mine, unflinching, raw. "I do," she said, the faintest quiver betraying her calm. "I've tried not to, but I can't, not anymore." The world outside ceased to exist. I stepped closer, careful, though every fiber of me wanted to close the gap entirely. Her breath brushed mine in the space between us, sweet and electric, and I could feel the tension coil tighter, impossible to ignore. "I shouldn't," I started, then stopped, my own words sounding hollow even to me. The thought of consequences, judgment, the impossibility of it all, flickered in my mind, but it was swallowed instantly by the pull of her nearness. She tilted her head slightly, eyes softening. "Don't," she whispered. "Not now." Her hand hovered near mine, and I reached out, brushing her fingers. She didn't pull away. Instead, she let our hands rest together, the contact light but enough to ignite something deep, a current I couldn't name. My thumb traced the back of her hand almost without thinking, and I felt her inhale sharply, a sound that made my chest tighten. I leaned in, the faint warmth of her cheek brushing against mine, and she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned toward me, eyes closing for just a fraction, letting the tension linger, letting the possibility stretch on the knife edge of decision. I want this," I whispered, voice low, barely audible. "I don't care about anything else." Her lips parted slightly, and I saw the same desperate honesty mirrored there. "Neither do I," she breathed, hand lifting to rest lightly on my chest. The tremor in her fingers matched the quickening beat of my heart. Time slowed. The space between us shrank to inches, and every sense sharpened. I could feel the warmth of her skin, smell her faint scent, soft, intimate, and hear the subtle catch in her breathing. Our eyes locked, unflinching, speaking the words we couldn't say aloud. Then, almost painfully, the decision pressed down. Step back and lose this fragile connection forever? Or surrender fully, messy and human, and risk everything for a chance at what neither of us could deny? I chose. My forehead rested against hers, our breaths mingling, and I let go of all restraint. Her hand found mine, fingers intertwining, and we stayed there for a long, suspended beat, either of us moving, letting the closeness speak for everything. "Finally," she murmured, a whisper carried just for me, and I could feel the weight of her past regrets, the loneliness, the fear, dissolve in that single moment. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. We didn't need words. The truth of us, the attraction, the longing, the impossible draw, was undeniable, messy, and real. The line between hesitation and surrender blurred, and for the first time, clarity arrived. We understood each other fully, not just what we wanted, but why, and that made everything else irrelevant. The porch, the morning, the world beyond the railing, all of it shrank to the heat, the tension, the quiet certainty that this moment was ours. And in that suspended, trembling, human heartbeat, we finally let ourselves exist together, fully seen, fully wanting, and entirely unafraid. The evening air was soft, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from her garden. We sat on her porch steps, shoulders brushing, hands intertwined, and for the first time since that first market encounter, the world felt slow, safe, and ours. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder, and I could feel the quiet rhythm of her breathing, steadying me, grounding me. There were no words, not yet, just the simple, human comfort of being near someone who had become more than an infatuation, more than a curiosity, someone I wanted to see, know, and protect. "I still can't believe this is real," I murmured, letting my fingers trace the back of her hand, memorizing the curve of each knuckle. She laughed softly, a sound that made my chest tighten with warmth. "It is," she said. We've taken our time, haven't we? Careful with each step. But maybe that's what made it feel like this." Her words hung between us, gentle but full of truth. She tilted her head up to meet my gaze, eyes soft, unguarded, and I realized the age gap, the hesitation, the fear of judgment, no longer mattered. We had crossed that invisible line and found something real on the other side. I pulled her closer slightly, careful not to startle her, and she leaned into me, letting me hold her in a way that felt like home. Her hair brushed my cheek, soft and scented with the faint traces of lavender and earth, and I breathed it in, letting the moment settle into memory. "You're different," I said, voice low. "I've never felt like this before." She smiled, warm and quiet, brushing a hand along my arm. "Neither have I," she admitted. "It's messy. Scary sometimes. But worth it." We sat like that for a long time, the sun setting low behind the houses, casting gold and pink across her porch. Every so often, our fingers intertwined more tightly, a small, unspoken promise. We were here, together, and nothing else mattered. At one point, she leaned her forehead against mine, eyes closing, and I mirrored her. The warmth of her skin against mine, the soft exhale she let slip, made the tension of all those past weeks, the near misses, the hesitation, the unspoken desires, fade into something gentle, human, and real. "I think I could get used to this," I whispered. "Me too," she replied, lips brushing against my temple in the softest kiss imaginable, a seal of trust, affection, and belonging. The world outside her porch existed, but it didn't press in. There were no interruptions, no whispers of doubt, just two people who had navigated fear, desire, and longing, and had chosen to exist fully together. Finally, we leaned back against the steps, side by side, hands still intertwined. She rested her head lightly against my shoulder again, and I felt the steady, warm pulse of connection. It wasn't perfect, life never was, but it was ours, and that made it more than enough. I could feel her smile against my arm, the quiet contentment in her body, and I knew she could feel mine too. For once, no walls, no hesitation, no unspoken rules, just the messy, beautiful reality of two hearts choosing each other. And as the evening shadows deepened, we stayed there, together, fully present, fully seen, fully human. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?